All right, family covenant for the modern age, sons and daughters. How did humanity end up as orphans? Was it the fault of the father? No, it was the fault of the children. Adam and Eve were God's children who rebelled against him. The primary role of sons and daughters, then, is to not break the relationship with their father by sinning. Unfortunately, children have been sinning throughout history, which puts tremendous strain on the parents. And if the sin level gets high enough, the parents can and will exit the relationship. God did this when his people became too sinful. So there's no way human parents couldn't do this if their children got too sinful. Fortunately, our God is a loving God who said, "I will not leave you as orphans, I will come to you." Human parents should have the same attitude toward their sinful kids, even if they have to leave them for a while. The whole Bible is about the children of God. The people of Israel were frequently referred to as either God's sons or his daughters, both individually and corporately. Sadly, they were a rebellious, faithless, unfaithful, stiff-necked, ungrateful, conniving, grumbling, greedy, whoring bunch of people. Children must be the exact opposite of this. They must be obedient, faithful, thankful, useful, kind, understanding, trusting, patient, honoring, and loving name bearers of their parents. Jesus was the true child of God who never failed in his role. Even when he passed through the most extreme trials, he did not bring shame on the name of his Father. Instead, he cried out with a loud voice, "Why have you forsaken me?" Children must look to this example instead of turning rebellious. It's okay for hurting children to cry out and question their father, but it's never okay to rebel and dishonor his name. In Malachi chapter 1, God says, "A son honors his father, and a slave his master." If I am a father, where is the honor due me? If I am a master, where is the respect due me? In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." We can see then just how important it is for children to honor their parents. It's not optional. But what does honoring parents actually look like? Again, we should look to Jesus. He was obedient unto death. He was always engaged in his Father's work. He was always bearing his Father's name to holiness. He put his Father's will above his own. In our culture today, children are not expected to be 100% obedient to their father, or engage in his work, or bear his name to holiness, or put their father's will above their own. If children are stubborn and rebellious, they don't even have to face any consequences in our society. They certainly wouldn't get stoned for their crime, like in Deuteronomy chapter 21. The problem with any kind of sin is that it leads to the death of the relationship. God commands parents to discipline their children and train them properly so that the family will be kept alive. If a son is going to be stubborn permanently, it means he's dividing himself from the family and may as well be dead. The entire generation of people that God rescued from Egypt died because they were rebellious. There was no reason for them to treat God this way because he was leading his children to a home where he would live with them forever. If he had been leading them toward homelessness, then sure, they would have had every reason to be rebellious. But God was taking them out of homelessness into a beautiful land that they could call home. Just because they were temporarily in a desert didn't mean that they had any right to rebel against their father. It's the same for children today. If the father is leading the family to a good place, any temporary desert must be endured with patience. If, however, the father is not leading the family to a good place, then the child only has one of two options. One, try to make the father change course, and two, leave the family. The problem with leaving the family is that it results in either more desert or slavery. And the problem with trying to make the father change course is that it comes against his most sacred rights, direction, and ownership. How can a son be a good follower if he calls into question the very direction of the family? Or how can a daughter be a good possession if she leaves her father's ownership? Leaving his ownership would require leaving her role as a daughter, which would empty her of responsibility and identity. It's a tough spot to be in for sure. Perhaps the best option is to follow Paul's advice about reproving older men. Do not rebuke an older man, but appeal to him as to a father. Appealing seems a lot better than rebelling, but how exactly is a person supposed to appeal to their father? It's certainly a foreign concept for most people, which is understandable since they probably were never taught how to do it in the first place. Luckily, we have many examples of how to do it in the Bible. God is the Father who wants his people to appeal to him. He frequently uses phrases like, "ask of me," or "come to me." Not only does he welcome his children's appeals, but he requires it as a show of faith. When Jesus was teaching his disciples about prayer, he told a story of a widow who kept badgering a judge to give her justice. The judge finally gave in and granted her justice. Then Jesus said, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" Jesus equates relentless prayer to faith. Faith tries hard to change the trajectory of a situation. It does not passively accept things the way they are. Rahab tried hard to change the trajectory of her impending death, and God granted it to her. Ruth relentlessly clung to her mother-in-law until she relented and allowed her to go to the promised land with her. Hezekiah wept bitterly and asked God to remember him, and God healed him. David appealed to God countless times that he would incline his ear to him, and God listened. In Psalm 18, he says, "In my distress I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears." With his dying breaths, the thief on the cross asked Jesus to remember him, and Jesus granted him salvation. It's clear that appealing to God is necessary for salvation. God actually wants his people to not like the way the world is going and cry out to him for change. Without this discontentment, a person can't discover true faith. But the discontentment is only regarding the present situation, not the future that God promised. It's because of God's good promises that we cry out for his intervention in the present. If God didn't promise to lead us out of the desert, why would we follow him at all? But he does promise that. And he was the only one who ever promised Israel that he would lead them to a good land. None of the other gods promised them anything. The people despised God's promise by chasing after promiseless idols. Sure, their life got better temporarily, but it got a lot worse permanently. They ended up lost and dead because they turned away from God's good promises. This has been happening throughout history, and it will happen to us today if we take our eyes off God's good future. It's better to live in a desert with God's good promises than to be lost with no promises. In fact, if God didn't give us good promises, we would have no way to even evaluate our present condition to begin with. Who's to say that a desert is bad? Just because hot sand is blasting your eyeballs, why is that bad? Is it bad because it's uncomfortable? Would you be happy if the sand stopped blowing in your eyes so you could see the desert more clearly? Or would it take a complete change of environment for you to feel like you had a good life? Why would you even try to change your environment unless you actually believed that there was a better life somewhere out there? None of the children of Israel had ever been to the promised land. So how would they know it was better than the desert? The answer is because God described it to them. He frequently called it a land flowing with milk and honey, and he said they would take possession of homes which they did not build. These things were relatable to them. They knew what milk and honey were. They knew what home ownership was. The point is, God's good promise gave them hope, and those who believed his promise received it. All fathers must give their families hope by promising a future of good things, especially togetherness. Without this hope, the family's present wilderness will be unbearable. This is why family members often wander further into the desert, looking for their own unpromised, promised land. After all, what do they have to lose in a promiseless desert? Even losing your own father is inconsequential when the death of the family is inevitable. The single most powerful thing a father can do to breathe hope into his lost family is the promise of a promised land. This promise gives the family something to move toward, and they can structure their lives around it. Suddenly, your father becomes the most important person in the world because he is the one who will take you out of the desert. But the father's promise must not be empty. He must gird himself with strength to actually deliver on the promise. The children must show maximum faith in him and stay close by his side. The more faith they have in him, the faster they will get to the promised land. The father must remind the children of the promise constantly to keep their faith alive. If they lose sight of the promise, their faith will die, because faith is only possible in the promise of the Father. If the children find themselves in a position of suffering, they must make an appeal to their father instead of grumbling. This should be done directly and humbly. When the children of Israel were thirsty in the desert, they grumbled instead of simply asking God for water. They also became greedy for meat, even though God had provided abundantly for them with manna from heaven. Instead of fixating on their current surroundings, they should have been rejoicing that God was taking them out of the desert into a land flowing with milk and honey. By demanding meat in the desert, they were showing no respect for God's deliverance. A desert isn't the place for feasting. It's the place to show your father that you're willing to go without because you trust his word. Jesus performed this flawlessly when he was in the desert and rejected Satan's temptation by saying, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." The word of the Father is the food in the desert. Children must learn to feast upon the word until it finds fulfillment in the promised land. The child's appeal can also include a reminder of their relationship to the Father. Moses reminded God, "Consider that this nation is your people." David often appealed to God as his servant. "Turn to me and have mercy. Grant your strength to your servant. Save the son of your maidservant." When the prodigal returned home, he simply wanted to be made a servant. But when he spoke the word Father, it affirmed his identity as a son. Jesus taught us to pray, "Our Father." And every time we use these words, we are reminding God of our position as his children. After the position has been established, an appeal follows. "Give us this day our daily bread. Deliver us from the evil one." Appealing is an everyday part of a child's life. "Mom, can I have some chocolate? Dad, can we get a puppy?" But somehow this childlike appeal process gets driven out of us by adulthood. And many people go through their whole adult life without really appealing to anyone. You could almost conclude that our culture doesn't find appealing appealing. Why is this? Perhaps children face more and more rejection until they just stop asking altogether. Why risk rejection when you could just become self-sufficient and always say yes to yourself? Parents should be aware of this decline in appeal making and try to reverse it by establishing it as a child's fundamental right. For example, if a son asks his father for candy, the father can say, "Son, you know it's my job to take care of you, and you already ate some candy today. So my answer is no. But I don't want you to get discouraged and not come to me next time. It's your right to ask me for things. And I love it when you come to me and ask for all kinds of things. As your father, I have the right to say yes, no, or later. It's your job to trust me so that we can have a good relationship for the rest of our lives. When you don't get your way, I want you to accept my decision with thankfulness, not grumbling. I want you to trust that I know best for our family. I don't want you to sulk because that will make me feel like I hurt you. Hurting you is the last thing I ever want to do because you're my strength and joy, and I love you so much. Sometimes I have to say no to protect you. Give me a hug and promise that you'll come to me again when you want something, okay? The Bible gives us many examples of people appealing to authority figures. These usually involve things such as bowing down to the person, calling them Lord, preparing a feast for them, etc. The appeals were rarely as direct as they would be in our culture and involved an element of preparatory groveling. Nehemiah, for example, looked dejected until the king noticed and asked him about it. He didn't make his appeal until the king held out the offer for it. David looked dejected many times before God took notice. Israel itself had looked dejected in Egypt before God took notice. So fathers need to notice when their family is hurting. If a child is sad, sick, or heartbroken, the father must take notice and act. Esther prepared 2 banquets for the king before she made her appeal. Then she fell at his feet and wept in her final cry for the king's intervention. The woman who anointed Jesus also sat weeping at his feet. Many others bowed down to Jesus before making an appeal. Jesus himself bowed down to his Father before making an appeal. Abraham bowed down to the ground when the 3 strangers visited him and also when he bought some land from the Hittites. He called the leader of the Hittites Lord. Daniel also called Nebuchadnezzar Lord. As a general observation, biblical culture was much more respectful than our culture today. How did we get to this state? Wouldn't it be better if we went back to that culture? Changing cultures, though, is extremely hard because right from birth, children learn what is acceptable and not acceptable. Bowing down to someone and calling them Lord is entirely unacceptable in our modern culture. So to get back to biblical culture, people would have to face the extreme awkwardness of actually doing it. Can you imagine bowing down to a stranger like Abraham did, or calling someone your Lord? Maybe if everyone started doing it at the same time, it would be possible, but most Christians today don't seem to have any interest in changing anything about Western norms. If they did, they would teach their children something different, but that would be awkward for them, and people avoid awkwardness at all costs. One of those awkward biblical ideas would be living together, even after the kids had grown up. This would give the children the opportunity to pay back their parents for all their hard work and investment, and it would keep the money within the family. According to Statistics Canada, the average cost of raising a child is over $250,000. No wonder parents are exhausted by the time their children graduate. But will they get paid back anytime soon? Not in today's culture. See, the child was forced to go to school and learn about everything other than work and money for the past 18 years. So when they finally graduate, they have no idea how to make enough money to pay their parents back. Plus, they're forced to move out and find their own path in life, so they only have 2 options. Either they can find a job and rent their own basement suite, or they can take out student loans and go to school. Neither of these options gives the child the ability to pay their parents back anytime soon. If the child gets a grunt job making $15 an hour, he'll be lucky to have a few $100 at the end of the month with which he can begin paying back his parents. But even if he pays them back $400 a month for the next 50 years, he still won't have paid them back the full $250,000. Who can live like that? Nobody can, which is why children try to get ahead in life by taking on debt. By going the debt route, they'll be enslaved to the bank for the next 50 years, but at least they might have enough equity in their house at that point to be able to pay back their parents a lump sum of $250,000 on their 93rd birthday. The parents will die the following year and give the $250,000 back to their child, plus probably an extra $250,000 that they accumulated in their lives, which begs the question, what on earth just happened? What was the point of all those years of work and debt which separated the family? Why wasn't the parents' money transferred earlier so that they could have enjoyed a bit more time together? Why did the child just finish paying $250,000 of interest to the bank and then suddenly get that same amount of money back from the parents? Is there any biblical justification for this kind of estate management? The only times children in the Bible were ever in debt was when they were cut off from their father, like Jacob was. Debt was always seen as a bad thing, and debt forgiveness was always seen as a good thing. God loved debt forgiveness so much that he set aside certain years where everyone had to do it. But like most of God's ideas, the people never put them into practice. The year of Jubilee, for example, was never observed. Even the Passover went unobserved for long periods of time before someone would wake up and realize the mistake. God talks a lot about money in the Bible, and we need to wake up and repent if we don't like his ideas. Children are supposed to make life easier for their parents, not harder. But in today's upside-down world, kids make life harder for their parents, which is why they only want 1 or 2 kids. And this isn't the fault of the children, it's the fault of the parents for having a worldview that doesn't line up with the Bible. In the Bible, children weren't sent off to school from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. They actually had useful roles in the home, such as gathering sticks or fetching water from the river. Nowadays, though, children are nothing more than a resource drain for 18 years straight. They literally spend most of the day away from home, either stuck in school or playing video games with their friends. They contribute absolutely nothing to their parents' estate. Who on earth came up with an idea like this? Children belong at home with their parents so that they can work hard to help the family. God commanded parents to be the teachers of their children, not strangers. Imagine how happy children would be if they could stay at home and contribute to their parents' lives. Children want to do this, but they're prevented from this by their own parents in our society. No wonder kids end up so depressed and parents end up so exhausted. Children were never meant to live apart from their parents. Think how happy parents would be if they could live with their kids and receive full-time help. When kids grow up under this worldview, they feel like a burden to their parents because they know their education is costing a ton of cash and their parents aren't getting anything back for it. Doing chores doesn't feel like a contribution to the family's estate at all. Children need to feel like they're adding something valuable to the home now, not 18 years down the road. This is why boarding school is so destructive to a child's mental health. They literally can't do anything to help their parents. And if they don't find a way to become successful in life, they feel like an utter failure in the family. But they shouldn't get bitter. Rather, they should appreciate the fact that their parents tried to do what they thought was best at the time, which was giving their child a good education. Parents in this situation, though, need to apologize to their children for not giving them the ability to play a contributing role in the family. Mistakes like this can shatter the parent-child relationship forever. The only way to heal the broken bond is through mutual understanding, apology, and forgiveness. Explaining decisions is perhaps the most powerful way to prevent misconstrued intentions in a family. Children often feel unloved or abandoned simply because they miss the true motivation behind their parents' decision. If parents want to prevent this from happening, they need to create a culture of honesty and openness in the home. But sometimes decisions are so painful that parents themselves are afraid to talk about them, so they put on a tough face. The problem with this strategy, though, is that the child might interpret the toughness as apathy. For example, if a father has a tough face when he goes off to war, his children might think he's not actually fighting for them, but just fighting because he has to. It's better if the children can see him cry in the face of the tough decision, because it will show them that he loves them so much and needs their encouragement. The hardest aspect of these situations is the uncertainty that comes along with geographical separation. In the Philippines, for example, almost every family has a member working overseas. It's common for mothers to leave their little girl behind and go work in Hong Kong for years at a time, or fathers to go to the Middle East on a 5-year contract, leaving their pregnant wife behind. Naturally, this results in an extreme absence of role fulfillment. Children get raised by their grandparents. Husbands get no comfort from their wives. Mothers don't get to kiss their children goodnight. These unfulfilled roles leave a gaping hole in the heart of the family. Is it even worth it to get married and have children under these circumstances? Not really. But if the ball has been set in motion, the least the parents can do is explain to their children why they have to be separated. The conversation could go something like this: Son, I wish we could be together. Families aren't meant to be separated. The reason I have to be in the Middle East is because I'm doing the best to care for our family. I wish I could walk you to school every day and play basketball with you in the evening. I can't wait to do those things with you in the future. But in the meantime, I need you to be strong and understand why I can't be there now. And I need your encouragement too, because it's hard for me to be so far away from my family. I love you, and I'll come back as soon as possible. Just like children need to recognize their parents' challenges, parents need to recognize their children's challenges. When children get rebellious, they're often reacting to something a parent can't see. It's just like a reaction to asbestos. You can see the symptoms, but you can't always see the source. Emotional allergies today go completely misdiagnosed because nobody can see the source. The source is covenant violation. Every time the family covenant gets violated, there will be a reaction within the family. The reaction might be anger, sadness, unresponsiveness, or any other negative thing. As soon as people see a reaction, they need to return to the covenant to make a proper diagnosis. Parents often can't see what's really going on in their children's lives because of the drastic cultural changes that have taken place since they themselves were children. This presents massive challenges for parents as they try to navigate things like internet, education, video games, politically driven cartoons, etc. When they were kids, they watched Bugs Bunny and made forts in their backyard. Now their kids are watching transgender cartoons and learning about abortions in their sex ed class. How on earth are parents supposed to know how to navigate this? Children must realize this difficulty and cut their parents lots of slack. But parents need to try to figure out what's going on in their children's lives by talking to them every day. Parents make mistakes, and children must confess those mistakes to God. Psalm 106 says, "Our fathers in Egypt did not understand your wonders. They did not remember your abundant kindnesses, but rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea." Many of the great men in the Bible confessed the sins of their ancestors. For example, Nehemiah prayed, "Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses." Daniel confessed the sins of Israel. Stephen confessed the sins of Israel. Jesus himself bore the sins of Israel. So children today should try to reverse the sins of their parents by confessing them and committing to a life of holiness. Just because the parents or grandparents have died It doesn't mean that children can't confess their sins. Generally speaking, children have a pretty good idea of what the sins of their ancestors were, because they themselves are suffering from those exact same tendencies. Children must also carry the name of their father forward after his death by dwelling on his land. Normally, only the sons would do this because the daughters would get married off and live on their husband's land. But in Numbers 27, we see some daughters who wanted their father's land because he had no sons. They were concerned about the continuation of his name and therefore wanted to inherit his land. When Moses consulted God about it, God said the daughters were right. So daughters today should also be concerned about their father's land because it bears his name. The passage also explains how God wants the estate to be handled if a man has no sons or daughters. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. So Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and give their father's inheritance to them. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it." We can see here that inheritance is extremely important to God, and we can also see a fundamental difference between sons and daughters. Sons are the keepers of their father's name, but daughters lose their father's name when they come under the name of their husband. This is why daughters are seen as a conundrum in many cultures around the world, because they represent a loss of strength to the family. Since wives are owned by their husbands, they have to go and live with his family and bear children under his name. Countless daughters have been murdered or abandoned because their parents didn't think it was worth the investment to care for them until marriage. We must fiercely oppose this practice, just like Lillian Trasher did in Egypt in the early 1900s. In her early days in the country, she was shocked to find that it was common practice for people to abandon their little girls out in the open and leave them to die. So she decided it was her calling to build an orphanage and care for these abandoned children. Sons and daughters are equally valuable, and sex selection is an evil practice. God is the one who gives families sons or daughters, and He has a purpose for each of their lives. No matter what their gender is, they need to honor their father and mother and try to fulfill their role properly by relying on the Bible as a guide.